Okay, thank you for coming. The first thing I should say is that this chart is in English, as you probably guessed. It wasn't indicated on the schedule, but we'll take about 40-45 minutes. We'll go through the slides and we'll leave some time at the end of it for Q&As. So my name is Claudio. I work as head of application security for the Workshop, which is a software house, a company that we'll spend a bit of time talking about. I've been in security for about 20 years. Have been through a number of different roles, from Linux engineer back in the 90s, system engineers, programmer, AppSec consultant, and finally moved over to the end user side, working for the Workshop, which has brought an interesting set of challenges and some really interesting lessons that we learned along the way. So what I'd like to do today is share this experience with you, this journey with you. I've been working for the Workshop for just under a couple of years. As many software houses, we've tried to understand some of the pain points and some of the challenges that come with setting up a security program. So what's a security program? What does it actually mean? In a development, as you likely know, it's not just really about fixing a set of challenges or a specific set of issues. It's really about understanding what the requirements and what the challenges are, and align solutions, tools, and so on with the objectives of the company. We've had a busy year in 2019. We've had over 400,000 deployments, 90,000 builds, 150 software products that we currently maintain, which are under current development. And then those numbers are likely to go up in 2020. Just a few words about the Workshop as an employer. It's a really good place to work. We employ 35 different nationalities. I'm myself Italian, spend a lot of time working in the UK, and I'm now in Spain, lovely Malaga. We have 149 developers. I would say there's about 2/3 of the company is actually made up of developers. So it's a really, really strong technical drive at the Workshop. And we have offices in London and Malaga. So I used to work in London, and now I'm based in Malaga. So great culture, great place to work at. Can't really start without explaining what it takes to build a team, and what does it mean to actually have an application security team. And by the way, this is an interactive talk, right? So if you've got questions, something is not clear, if you want a challenge, put your hand up and feel free to interrupt me. But what I'd like to do is basically explain what does it mean to have an application security team. And contrary to belief, it's not just about having a team that does and looks after security holistically. What does it mean? Security is a shared responsibility, and we'll hopefully talk about this and share more about this as part of this deck. But you'll see at the very top is my team. So dotted lines are dotted reporting line into me. We have DevOps, delivery services, CI/CD, security champions. So these are people that are, generally speaking, senior developers, people which have a lot of experience within individual development teams or tribes. They take responsibility for the security within their teams. We have architects, of course, and then as direct reports, we have application security engineers and senior application security engineers. And what you see at the bottom of the slide is basically an attempt to try and define responsibilities and activities. So what is it that we do as part of an AppSec team and as part of an AppSec program? We have everything. Obviously, a lot of it is code reviews. We spend a lot of time reviewing code. We spend a lot of time ensuring the code is either compliant with security requirements, so that we're doing things right and we're doing things properly. We spend a lot of time, probably more than we like, on tooling, getting things to work, prototyping, making sure that we have a flow. And especially because this is a relatively new function, everything had to be built from the ground up. So obviously, we'll try and leverage as much as possible what's there. We didn't have to rebuild our full CI service, but we try and leverage our CI service as much as possible to try and automate security as much as possible. So tooling is a big part of running a security program. We spend a lot of time with security requirements, and you'll see the responsibilities change depending on what we do here, right? When it comes to code reviews, we have the entire application security teams, we have the security champions, so development, we have architects, but we don't really involve delivery services and DevOps in that. When it comes to tooling, DevOps, delivery services, and AppSec are basically an integral part of what we're trying to do. But when we start looking at security requirements, coding standards, we're trying to define responsibilities so there is an element of accountability, right? So people know that this is my job. It's my job to define the security requirements for this project. It's my job to understand what it takes to get things secured. And we continue that cycle. We're trying to effectively have a standard approach, a standard routine. So weekly or bi-weekly or quarterly, we meet and basically try and push that initiative forward. And those are basically driven by canvases within the context of our work. Dependency management is a big subject that we'll spend a bit of time talking about, testing, training, incident response. So you'll see basically why I've drawn this up, because security is not the responsibility of a single team, but really it's a responsibility that is shared across the wider business and the wider organization. So what are the challenges that we've encountered? So some background here. So I started working at the workshop at the end of July or September in 2018, and there wasn't so mine is a new function, mine is a new role. It wasn't present before. So we had to basically try and think, what is it that we're trying to do here? What is it that we're trying to fix? What are the problems that we're trying to address? And we defined, together with some of the senior stakeholders, some of the key challenges. And the first one that came up, and is really prevalent in what we're trying to do, is security awareness. Knowing what to do is hard. Application security is hard, generally speaking, and it's something that a lot of people tend to confuse for security testing. But there is a myriad of different challenges that will come from understanding and securing software products, securing processes, sharing knowledge, knowing what to do. And creating a sense of awareness was the first thing that we decided to try and tackle. How do we do that? We looked at setting up working groups, we looked at training, but more importantly, we wanted to basically involve people in the creation of tools and creation of processes. So one of the things that we decided to do from day one was security is not a team that's supposed to be acting as a service, so to speak, but we are there as in a consulting function. So everything that we decided and everything that we built needed the buy-in of some of the senior stakeholders and some of the different parts of the business as well. So working on that and understanding how to do certain things was a really big part of what we did. So understanding how to get that message across and explaining that security wasn't just an add-on, but something that basically was intrinsical to the code, to the quality of our code. Legacy code base. It became an issue. It wasn't originally seen as an issue, but became an issue during our initial code reviews. So we'll explain a little bit about what happens as part of our code reviews. How do we get to code reviews, and what are the flags and triggers that actually get us to sit down and start going through code? But we noticed that a lot of the stuff that was being picked up, a lot of the stuff that was being flagged about our tools, really wasn't hard to fix. I mean, in most cases was about implementing libraries, was implementing parsers, was implementing things which are now commonly available to us. So why was it not there? Why was it not done? Because in most cases, the code was written 6, 7, 9 years ago. I mean, one thing that keeps on coming up, for example, an example is feature secure processing, which is a security controls to mitigate XXEs, so XML external entities, which is something that's prevalent. If you're doing any type of XML processing, if you're writing parsers for XML, it's the sort of stuff that keeps on coming up. And the fix for that is really trivial. Enabling feature secure processing is something that addresses the denial of service intrinsically. So why was it not implemented? Why was it not all over our code? Because the feature was introduced in 2013. And a lot of our code actually precedes that. It was built in 2009, 2010, it was built pre-Java 7, so a lot of these features were not available at the time. So having legacy code makes it difficult, because in most cases, you're looking at refactoring stuff. So dealing with that is a big part of what we do. Code wasn't just built in most cases a couple of years ago, but we're having to deal with legacy code, which is a lot older than that. The third challenge is scalability. So how do you address issues when you have 5 development teams, 50 people strong? We have 38 tribes, almost 360 products in scope, 4 backend languages, 56 products. It's hard. Really good questions. There are small teams that basically make up development teams. It probably makes sense to actually explain the tier and the structure that we have. So within a business, we have some mega teams. So we have teams responsible for web platform, we have teams responsible for gaming, we have front-end teams and so on. Within each individual teams, you have what are known as tribes. So tribes are a small team made up of 4 or 5 different people, which have a specialism, specialize on a specific function. So you have a tribe that looks after login, for example. You have a tribe that looks after logic flows about password resets. You have tribes that look after econ processing, for example, right? So the idea is that you define an area of specialism and then you assign a tribe to it. The tribe name remains the same, but people will tend to rotate across different tribes to effectively acquire that level of specialism that is required to then drive features. So scaling and making this so that we don't fix the same things over and over, but we have a process that allows us to say, hey, this is broken, or this is something that needs to be looked at, or this is something that we need to suppress because we accept the risk. We don't want to do this over and over again. But that level of automation and allowing us to actually do this consistently time in and time out is hard. So scalability was a big challenge, and we'll hopefully see how we address that challenge as part of the initiatives that we spun up. Commercial stakeholders. Security doesn't work in a vacuum, and development doesn't work in a vacuum. You always having to deal with external requirements, and these requirements generally are driven by commercial stakeholders, product. I guess anyone that's actually worked in development environments will know that generally speaking, product will try to go for a low friction approach. They want to effectively reduce the amount of friction on the end user as much as possible. An example of this could be capture, right? Capture is an anti-bot, is an anti-automation mechanism that really should be applied if you have a public facing website. If you've got, say, a login form, if you've got a password reset form, if you've got any high-risk flows, these high-risk flows should be protected with capture. But capture obviously comes with its own challenges. Capture, if there is a perception that capture picks up a risky behavior or a risky actor, then capture will challenge you. This is capture v2. Believe it or not, we had to fight to implement capture v2 again on some of the endpoints because product wanted a low friction approach. And it's only by looking at the data and producing a use case or a business case that says, hey, we're losing this much money and we are enabling tens of thousands of people to sign up or abuse our endpoint systems, that we actually managed to persuade them that recapture was the right way to go. We're now looking at v3, which has a slightly different approach to solving the same problem. But that challenge and having to find a compromise between what product owners and commercial stakeholders want and what we want to do from an engineering perspective is a challenge that has to be addressed. Open source components is a massive challenge. We want to be agile, we want to try and reuse the same libraries, use the same components, but actually keeping those components secure or even having a patching schedule that allows us to deal with that, it's something that is actually taking a lot of work. So we'll see how we have a solution in place at the moment that kind of works. It gives us an understanding of some of the stuff that's broken and some of the stuff that has to be upgraded or some of the stuff that has to be bumped, but it's not good enough. It doesn't actually provide us with the level of automation that we wanted. So we're looking at the next gen at the moment, and we'll look at this when we deal with SCA and software composition analysis. And finally, outside threats, people that are out there to get us. You've got your standard attacks, and I guess what application security is standardly seen as protecting our assets and protecting our products and software from external threats is something that we do day in, day out. So what are the primary objectives? What are we trying to do as part of this? So primary objective is the protection of the business from attacks. They happen consistently, and we learn from those. We change and adapt a strategy to try and to protect from an ever-evolving threat. Even in the course of 18 months, we'll see threats changing, the type of attacks changing, so it's important to basically stay up to speed. We want to improve the prevention and detection of security defects. Why? Because it actually makes it easier to fix stuff that we see very early in the development life cycle. You've probably all heard about shifting left, but having a system and having a mechanism that allows us to see things as soon as they're introduced into our code and also detect existing issues is very important. We want to reduce cost of securing software. We want to make it as effective and as efficient as possible. And we want to enable business to manage risk. We want to effectively allow the business the information to make a decision as to whether something needs to be fixed or something needs to be accepted. There's, generally speaking, 3 potential outcomes when you're looking at security defects. Is either a false positive, the tools have picked up something that looks like a security defect but it's not. They have detected a true positive, but at that point the decision has to be made as to what to do with it. Do we fix it or do we park it? Do we accept it and then potentially take another look at it in a few months' time? Providing the business with that information is critical so that we can manage risk. If we don't know how critical something is, if we don't know how exploitable something is, and if we don't see what's wrong, then it's very difficult for us to fix it. And then finally, engage and share knowledge. Like I said, the intention of a security team is never to be a self-standing isolated entity. The objective of a security team is to allow development teams to be self-reliant. So effectively teach and share knowledge and allow them to try to catch as many of these things by themselves and act there as an escalation point. So this is one of the initiatives that we looked at. We decided to try and to automate a lot of the security testing that we do. We had an understanding of testing before. We're running regular scans using SonarQube, using some of the default settings within SonarQube, but in some cases, this wasn't automated, it wasn't reactive enough, and there's a lot of stuff that was basically falling through. Also, the quality profiles within SonarQube weren't actually standardized. So it was difficult to understand whether something was a threat or was a problem across all the different teams, or whether something was affecting a specific project or a specific team. So this is what the AppSec pipeline looks like. At a high level, everything starts with the build phase. So we develop, we build, and once we start submitting a build to our CI server, a set of artifacts are generated, and then you effectively trigger automated testing. So as part of each build plan, DAST is exception to that, and I'll explain why it's exception. But as part of each build, we run software composition analysis. So we basically look at the software and understand if there are vulnerable libraries, and if so, what should be done about those vulnerable libraries. We run static application security testing, so we'll effectively scan the source code to try and identify issues or defects within the source code. And then we do effectively automated penetration testing. This is something that originally we started running as part of each and every build, but we found that to be too aggressive and intrusive, so instead we're doing this as a nightly build. But the idea is that we try and automate as much as possible, and we do this as a regression test. So we see if there is a problem, we address the problem, we mark the issue, we mark the finding, and then we'll see if the same problem reoccurs over time. And the idea is that over time, the amount of problems that you find will go down, will decrease over time. If you're interested, this is the architecture that we take. Most of it is run within containers, within the context of a Bamboo CI server. So we're running using dependency check, which is an OWASP tool. We're using Sonar Scanner to do the SAST. And we're running ZAP proxy as a DAST tool driven by Selenium and driven by the E2E test. The idea here is to effectively keep the end-to-end test and integration test consistent every time. So whatever runs through the ZAP proxy will eventually end up attacking the application. We'll go into a bit more detail as part of the second part of the deck. One thing to notice here, so there's two things actually. So one is the how these containers are run. So there's a distinction between first class and second class citizens. So the first class citizens are containers which are always on. They span up and effectively run these operations and these actions consistently and continuously. And then you have the second class citizens, which are containers which are spun up specifically as part of each build. So you'll notice that all the testings and all the test tools that we're using, dependency check, Sonar, Zap, and the scanner, they spun up specifically as part of the build phase, and then they torn down. All the findings are fed into this tool called Defect Dojo, which acts as an aggregator and acts as an integrator into Jira. So Defect Dojo effectively has a set of rules that determines, right, if we see this and if this is relatable or correlatable with this other security finding, then we need to open up a Jira ticket. It needs to have this information in it, and a Jira ticket is then assigned to a specific team or assigned to a specific individual if there is a security champion assigned. The advantage of this approach is that we're making this process transparent to the developer. The developer itself is only involved when it comes to actually reviewing some of the findings. So we'll see some of the stuff that comes through or comes back from dependency check or Sonar. We'll have these working groups, but once we identify something that's confirmed, then the system kind of kicks in, right? And effectively allows us to automatically open a Jira ticket, automatically assign a Jira ticket, allow the Jira ticket to be worked, and once the ticket is closed, depending on the resolution of the Jira ticket, then we'll automatically update these tools. So the same problem won't occur again. And we've reduced time to fix. Well, there wasn't really a baseline when I started, and there's been security defects that have been in there for as long as months. The lead to fix time at the moment has been reduced to 3 to 4 working days. If there's something critical that's identified as part of the working groups, generally speaking, a week later, there's addressed and fixed. So it's had a significant improvement on timings. So this is the a representation of whereabouts the checks come into play. So you've got the checkout, you've got the build, you've got and the sequence in which the tasks are invoked within our CI server build plan. And these are the tools that we use. One thing that I have forgotten to mention is that all the tools that we use and all the tools that we see here are all open source. So you can go and experiment and you can go and build with those. We're trying to effectively build and maintain and contribute back to the open source community as much as possible. And everything that we have used so far, it's free, including the quality profile that we're using for Java scanning. So now we delve a little bit into the specific tools. So we've spoken about 3 different types: SAST, SCA, and DAST. So SAST is effectively source code scanning. And for this, we're using find-sec bugs. It's a great set of rules. It works for Java. I think there are similar plugins for .NET and C#, but find security bugs, it's perfectly adequate if you're running Java, whichever MVC or whichever framework you happen to run. And this is what it looks like. You probably all have seen Sonar in action, but once you enable find security bugs and you start building and you start scanning, you'll get a number of vulnerabilities. You can define the severity of these vulnerabilities, and you can set triggers. And this is what a vulnerability looks like. You'll get the issue type, and then you've got a description of what should be done to address that. You'll notice that this has been confirmed. So this is going through an internal review, and it's been defined as confirmed, meaning that we need to be doing something about this. So these eventually end up being reviewed as part of the code review session. So I was on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, this is the team, or part of the team anyway. There was a relatively quiet day looking and reviewing vulnerabilities. And then we've got a picture of an iceberg. What do you think that is? Tip of the iceberg. It's one of those things that keeps on happening as part of these code review sessions. Things that appear to be relatively trivial. So for example, XXC is one of the things that I've mentioned before, is a vulnerability that keeps on coming up that we are relatively good at now fixing and addressing. So this is easy, right? Do we need code reviews for that? Probably not. We know what's going on, we know what's happening. So the resolution is relatively straightforward. But it's when we get things like this that things get a little bit more interesting. Don't know if you can see. I'll try and read this out. This is a vulnerability that says use a dynamically generated random IV. In itself, this doesn't mean anything. It's very, very difficult to understand and comprehend, but this is a typical tip of the iceberg thing. When we started looking at this vulnerability, we started asking ourselves the question, well, first of all, what does it mean? So IV, it basically stands for initialization vector. It's a vector that's used in CBC encryption, and it's effectively the first block. Is the first block that gets used to then basically establish this CBC chain, and it's kind of made up of two different components. It's the IV and the key itself. So what this is saying is, hey, you're setting this statically. So you're not dynamically generating this key, but you're setting this key statically, and you automatically start thinking, why is it being set statically? If it's set statically, it doesn't mean it can't be changed. And then you start asking yourself, how many passwords have been encrypted this way? How many days, how many devs have hard-coded this key into the scripts to programmatically decrypt passwords? And you start unfolding a problem which is much, much, much bigger than what's actually being picked up by the SaaS tool itself. So this is why code reviews are really simple, are really useful, and it's almost impossible to rely on tooling alone to be able to address this type of issues. So having a conversation with development teams or people that perhaps even develop the code itself will give a much, much better insight into why things have been done in a certain way. So this is a pretty good example because this kicked off a secrets management program. Off the back of this single vulnerability, we sat down and said, hey, we don't do secrets management properly. We need to sit down and start thinking about how to fix this in the long run. So this is what I mean by the tip of the iceberg. This in itself was just the tip of the iceberg. And off the back of that, a lot of change occurred. A lot of change happened that allows us to address this type of vulnerability or this class of vulnerabilities in a much more effective way.
Sorry, I have a question. Regarding the previous slide, that there were tools for analyzing security effects. So which these tools works with any programming language? Can you perform against any language?
So the tool itself, so there's two tools at play here. The first one is a LinkedIn tool. It's called SonarQube. Right, generally speaking, is a tool that you use to check the quality of your code. You can do linting, you can do code quality, code smells, and also has a security function. So the rule set that scans the code is known as a quality profile. So within a quality profile, you can start enabling additional plugins. The plugin that we're using in this case is called Find Security Bugs, which is an OWASP supported plugin. It means that if you enable this, you're effectively telling Sonar, hey, you've got this set of rules that we can now use to start analyzing this. So this is Java specific, but you have versions of this for C#, you have versions of this for most of the programming languages, including Scala, because we found there's a slight deviation on the Find Bugs that works really well for Scala. So if you've got SonarQube, which I think is free, unless you want additional reporting features, all you need to do is basically build that and enable Find Security Bugs as part of the quality profile, and you'll start generating this type of findings in your code. You can do this manually using Sonar CLI, so the Maven Sonar CLI, or you can do this as part of the CI server build plan.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, and this is what an app Jira ticket looks like. So remember how we automatically and dynamically generating tickets? But this is what one looks like. You've got all sorts of different tags that we're using for filtering. We've got epic links, which are specific to the individual team. Here you've got the description of the issue that has been found. You've got a description, and also you've got recommendations. And this is something that basically ends up in a queue, right? It ends up in a queue, and then eventually gets moved to a Kanban board. And how this is addressed is something that obviously has to be negotiated with the senior stakeholders within the business. But we're getting a really good success rate in identifying and fixing this stuff these days. So I've got the UMIS pop-up that keeps on coming up on my screen. Okay. As always, I just wanted to basically show you this because the testing and the definition of abuse case to test is as important, if not more important, than the actual fix itself. So this is the XXC vulnerability, and it's been obfuscated obviously on purpose. But what that shows you is the amount of changes within the source code itself, within the business logic, not a lot. And this is actually part of the test themselves. So the amount of testing that needs to be done to ensure that the XXC vulnerability has been properly fixed, the definition of the DTD, the definition of the external entities, it's something that takes a lot of time. So we end up spending I guess proportionally, we end up spending probably about 20-30% of the time talking about the fix, and then the rest of the time is spent about how to define testing, how to define unit testing, and how to define abuse cases that will then prove that that is actually fixed once and for all. And what we tend to do as well is actually trying to make those abuse cases and unit tests as universal as possible, meaning that we can actually reuse them every time the same type of vulnerability comes up. Any questions on this? Cool. Okay. Now we go to the second initiative, or the second, I guess, stream work that we've implemented, both chronologically and in my view, in terms of importance and impact that it's had on the team, which is software composition analysis. SCA, which is effectively hunting for vulnerable components, it's a relatively new discipline. I guess it's a framework, and in terms of the tools defined to address some of the issues, it's not as mature as SAST, in my opinion, at the very least. But it is equally as important. I mean, you'll remember Strat as the Apache vulnerability that brought down Equifax, wasn't it, a couple of years ago? But luckily enough, it's down on the OWASP top 10. If you're not familiar with the OWASP top 10, look it up. It's pretty much one of the, I guess, entry points into security. In that it defines the most common threats. Not vulnerability, threats. These are the things that are likely to get your code or get your business. So having a look at those gives you a really good starting point as to what to do first from a security perspective. So it's really prevalent. If you run a scan on your software components, software libraries, chances are you'll find something that's out of date, and especially if you're using Node, and chances are it will actually contain some vulnerabilities. It doesn't mean they're exploitable. It doesn't mean that it can bring your business down, but it is something to keep an eye on because it becomes, the longer they left, the longer it becomes to actually refactor your code or bumping this up to keep them in check. Luckily, if you're running Java or if you're running Maven, enabling dependency check as a tool is really easy. It's literally an additional plugin within your pom.xml file. You run that as part of your build process, and you'll start generating this type of artifacts. So this is the artifact within a Bamboo build plan. You'll see there is an XML file called a dependency check. Sorry, there is an entry called dependency check. You click on that, and this is basically what the dependencies look like. You've got the dependency name, you've got the vulnerability IDs, you've got the package that contains those IDs, you've got how critical they are, you've got the CV counts, and it means you can do something about it, allegedly. It's not straightforward, and this is one of the things that we're struggling with the most. It's literally of information overload. We have simply too many reports for us to be able to deal with this effectively. So we're trying to think, and we're trying to find a different way of dealing with the same problem. So the next Gen SCA, or something that we currently look into, it's a tool called Dependabot that effectively attempts to do what we're doing manually, programmatically. It pulls down dependency files, it looks for insecure dependencies. If it finds dependencies, this is all configurable. It has filters and configuration settings, and allows us to open individual pull requests to update the high security, the high severity ones. The CI server can run regression tests automatically, and providing the older test pass, depending on how good your tests are, you can go ahead and merge. We ran a couple of prototypes over the last couple of weeks, and it looks really promising. But we need to fine-tune some of the configuration settings and some of the filters to allow us to only really identify and address the stuff that is important. A lot of the issues come from transitive dependencies as well. A lot of the stuff that gets brought up is brought in by boot spring, and these are things which can't be bumped without really taking a look at this from an architectural perspective. But it gives you a really good indication of whereabouts you should go. In some cases, they can be upgraded, they can be bumped with little work. In some cases, we need to look at this and address this as a major project. But as always, knowing is better than not knowing. How are we doing for time? Not bad, 35 minutes in. Okay, the third tool is DAST, which stands for Dynamic Application Security Testing, is effectively automated penetration testing. I use these words really carefully. I'm not suggesting that you can replace a pen tester with a tool by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some certain functions, there are certain activities that can be run programmatically. And generally speaking, that is what we use our DAST tools for. So we'll check endpoints, we'll check submission forms, we'll check parameters, we'll check HTTP hygiene, we'll check meta information within the HTTP headers, and ensure that, as far as we can tell, there's nothing really dodgy going on. So how does this work? Like I mentioned, everything should be standardized. Everything should run as part of a coherent testing structure. So any piece of code or any software products will have its own test, will have its own E2E test, will have its own integration test. And specifically for front-end components, these are critical. So little point in us developing and devising our own penetration tests and our own testing policies if they go and touch and test things which are very different from the E2E tests, right? We want to do the same thing. We want to basically look at this as a quality issue rather than a security issue. So we tend to reuse the E2E tests which are run against the front-end components and running through a proxy. The proxy will then generate a site tree, which effectively identifies the targets for the scan. So once we have these targets for the scan, the next thing that we do is set up the scan policies. So you'll notice that we're using the same tool, we're using ZAP. So the step number one is take a snapshot to tell us what it is that we're looking to attack, and then we attack. We attack using a defined set of scan policies. We want to test for injections, we want to test for path traversal, we want to test for use of insecure cookies, right? So these are things that we define as part of the security requirements. The security requirements go in here. They tell us effectively what we're going to be testing for. Then we attack the site, and we'll see if anything has changed from the last time. And we run this every night against our sites. And then you identify vulnerabilities that you then manage. Some of them are going to be critical, some of them are going to be informational, some of them are going to be high. So you'll go through them, you'll deal with them as part of the code review sessions, and then the stuff that's important, you tend to fix or trying to find time to fix and address. And this is the tool that we use. This is what the interface looks like. I'm not going to read for the long list of features, but this is what the tool is capable of doing. Again, it's a free tool. I think it's on version 2.9 at the moment. You can download it, you can play with it. One of the reasons why we do use ZAP versus Burp, for example, or other tools, is how customizable and how API ready it is. Everything is driven through the API, which is great if you're doing this programmatically as part of the CI build. And also supports DAST scripting, which is a scripting language which is really powerful for authentication and effectively session handling. So when you've got front-end components that define a particularly complex login flow, it's possible to emulate that using DAST scripting within the context of ZAP. But it's a really powerful tool. So the question that comes up very often is, how do we deal with noise, right? So we've got the three different types of testing tools. We've got SCA, we've got DAST, we've got SAS. There's a lot of stuff that's generating a lot of findings. So how do we deal with it? We can't be fixing everything, and we don't want to be fixing everything. So there's a requirement for us to start triaging this stuff and basically understand the stuff that's important, right? So this is the approach that we take at a high level. So everything that warrants our attention as part of these review sessions, it is open. Open means that the finding is confirmed. We want to be doing some further review and then make a decision. Is this a true positive or is it a false positive? If it's a true positive, that means it's real. Then we need to decide what to do. If it's a false positive, then it's fake. We close. That's an easy one, right? But the hard part is to decide whether we want to fix it or whether we want to accept. Accept doesn't mean, yes, we accept the work. Accept means we accept the risk. So we park that. We park that for the foreseeable future until this becomes important or something emerges that says, hey, we're going to take another look at this. And if we decide to fix, of course, we fix, we change the code, we refactor or make any necessary modifications, we test, and then once we're happy that this is fixed and all the tests are passed, then we'll close as well. But that's the approach that we take effectively for the triage of security defects. And then finally, for noise reduction, we've got highly tuned scan profiles. Again, if we know that something is basically generating noise, then we turn it off. We're trying to use a rule set which is as lean as possible. Rather than just turning everything on and go, well, we don't need this, we tend to generate rule sets from the security requirements. These are things that we have to look out for. These are things that are important to us. So we start creating those rule sets with the stuff that's important and then add on or remove if we notice that it creates noise. We only report medium severity and onwards. We don't care about information or stuff for now. Plenty of stuff to do. We prioritize geotickets based on severity. The flow that we built takes that into account and does that programmatically. We do a continuous update of scan policies, meaning that if we find something to be out of date, if we find something to be changed, we have found ways of programmatically feeding that back into the tools, so the tools know next time that this is not the sort of stuff that I should be flagging to you. So there is a continuous improvement method in place. And of course, we do manual and dynamic funding suppression. So there's things that we don't care about that we just want to turn off. Okay, so that was the tooling part. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have any inspection from time to time of these rule sets, of this noise reduction? Because you understand that it's too easy to make some rules which are incorrect, could be incorrect.
Yes.
So do you have some revision from time to time of this suppression of this rule set and so on?
Great question. Yeah, we do, consistently. So this is the process that we've been trying to automate. So generally speaking, when we make a decision about a specific rule, does it stay or does it go? Is this something that we want to see again? A good example of this could be, so we code in Java. Java is our main back-end language. And there's a lot of work, there's a lot of findings that we get on dependency injections and auto-wide injections, for example, auto-wide statements within a classes. Some teams want to see them, some teams don't. Some teams accept those as coding practices, some teams don't. They say, no, we want to fix this. This is something that we need to address and we need to basically turn off. So we try and create a mechanism that allows teams to have their own scan policies. So for example, some teams have now forked their own quality profile, and they have a quality profile with that rule still enabled, but not as a blocker, but as an informative rule. Think of it as your, kind of Git process. You have a sort of master branch, which is effectively your master quality profile, and then every team is basically free to fork their own branch and maintain their own branch. If they want to merge into the master branch eventually, they're free to do so. So we dealing with security policies as code, effectively. Which also means that based on the feedback that we have, again, we go through these code reviews and we identify things which are not important to us. There is software scripts that we have written that looks at a tag, and if something is basically identified as unconfirmed or something is identified as a false positive, it will automatically make an API call against the tool and then add that as a suppression in the suppression file. So for example, dependency check, so we know that there's a dependency that there's nothing that we can do about because it requires Spring Boot to be updated, which is not something that we plan to do over the next 5 to 6 months. We simply suppress that. So that basically creates an XML, creates an entry in the XML file. The XML file is automatically read up by the scanning tool, so I know that I don't need to worry about this, so I won't be flagging that as part of the next run. So that continuous kind of feedback cycle is effectively how we do it. Some cases we're going to have to do it manually. Some cases it's not as easy as basically marking it as confirmed or marking it as open. So that is a process that has to be finalized and completed manually. But yes, absolutely. We spend most of the time doing that.
I was mainly alerted by automatic suppression rules because it's something which is automatic may fail, and especially if we using regex for something like this.
You'll find what tools are you using for scanning? What tool are you referring to here? Is it a SAS tool, DAST tool? What is the tool that you're trying to suppress findings for?
No, I use personally linked in intention.
Okay.
So, and yes, sometimes automatic suppression works, but
Sometimes it depends on whether.
it may hide further occurrences which are important, could be potentially important. So
Yeah.
in this case, automatically created rules must be revised.
Okay, I completely agree. It's something that needs to undergo a review exercise. Conscious of time, because we've been running for 45 minutes, so I'll quickly go through this. I guess this is so we've spoken about technical tools, and we've spoken about tools, which is the technical part of the deck. This is more about processes and why it's important to have an understanding of what the security requirements are. Because without security requirements, it's practically impossible to have a security test. What are we testing for? If we don't know what's good and what's bad, then there's no point in testing stuff, right? You're simply going to get information that you're not going to be able to understand. So these are the full process or the full steps that generally takes us to testing. Everything starts with a threat model, which is basically thinking of abuse cases. I'm building this feature, I'm building this system. How can the system be abused? And you start thinking about all the things that could potentially go wrong. I guess it's a fine art, but it's something that I will strongly encourage anyone to do. It's not just about testing, but understanding how things can be broken. That's where interesting things tend to emerge. Off the back of that, you define security requirements. Okay, so I need to protect this endpoint. I need to authenticate this endpoint, and I need this level of authentication. I need 2FA to be triggered under this set of conditions, right? Understanding the use case allows you to define the security requirements. And once you have that, you've got a much better understanding of how this can be verified. For this, we use a framework called ASVS 4.0.1. ASVS stands for Application Security Verification Standards. It's another OWASP project, and it's based on the notion that there are different security requirements depending on how important and how critical your application is. There are 3 levels. For level 0, level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 0 is no security requirements. Static page, we don't care about security. Level 1 is these are the things which are quite basic that you ought to worry about and you ought to be checking the system against. Number 2 is fairly critical. We're dealing with PII information, private information. 3 is military grade. So we're still on the way to trying to fulfill most of the level 1 requirements, and it gives you an understanding of how complex some of these can be. The list of questions for ASVS is long. We have literally, I think, 267 questions for level 1. So we're trying to modularize this. We're trying to identify what the requirements are depending on the feature that we're building. So let's say, for example, that we're building an integration service API. We want to have into account authorization. We want to care about authentication operation, financial operations, tournament, tracking operations, and so on. So we define these are the ASVS domains. So each of those is a list of questions. So we basically select the questions which are relevant to us. No point in worrying about files and resources if we're not dealing with files and resources. That's the point, right? So we're trying to identify the domains which are relevant to us and automatically build a list of requirements that will then be asked the user. And this is what the requirements look like in the previous stage. What you see at the top are some of the questions that you will get asked. Verify the password is 64 characters long. Verify the passwords can contain spaces and truncation is not performed, and so on. They're written in plain English, but this is what developers tend to use to make sure that they haven't forgotten anything. And then you basically identify the type of testing that you need to perform. So again, this is a canvas. So how we drive feature development through canvases. So we define what we want this feature to do. In this case, we want this app to have login integration with this other app. and we go, okay, for this, you need to have checks for access control, you need to have checks for authentication, you need to have checks for AVS session. Meaning that you need to check this, and this, and you need to test using that framework. So we're trying to define a framework that people can use if they want to. This is not something that we enforce, but it's something that we provide developers as a framework. So they know what they're looking for, they know what their requirements are, they know what their use cases are, they know what the verification standards need to be, and also they need to know how to test, if they so wish. If not, they can come and ask. How are we doing for time, guys?
5 minutes maybe.
Okay. So we'll try and rattle through this, and then we'll leave some time for Q&As at the end of it. Finally, coding standards. Again, this is a supporting feature for most of our developers. I've used authentication, which is work in progress at the moment, to give you an understanding of what this looks like in terms of structure. So we define an abstract, why is authentication needed and why do we need it, design implementation flows, attacks, mitigations, how to write tests, summary, attacks in real life, and so on. So if you're looking to build a feature or that requires authentication, this gives you a guide, I guess, as to how to do authentication properly. We provide examples, so code examples of compliant and non-compliant code. And then we point to the type of test. These are all taken for the testing guide v4, by the way, which is another free open source resource that gives you guidelines for testing. So in this case, for example, we want to test that weak password policy is not implemented. In some cases, it's just about testing the logic. In some cases, about testing the code and writing unit tests. And then finally, sharing knowledge. Like I said, we want to ensure that the teams are self-reliant and they're able to kind of drive themselves from a security perspective. So there's really two things that we have done which have been really successful and really brought people around, both in terms of engagement and feedback, telling us things that we had to take into account. So we run monthly vulnerability review sessions. So every time we find something interesting as part of the review sessions and the coding review sessions, we tell people, hey, this is cool, this is how we fixed it, this is the stuff that we need to be doing. And so that people know, get awareness, and they know who to come and ask. We do exploits, show and tell. Sometimes if we need to write a fix and if the developer wants to prove and justify, hey, this is something important, this is something that we need to fix, he writes an exploit. And that's cool, right? That is basically what everyone thinks about when they think about application security. So we have exploits, show and tell. This is how we broke and run applications. This is how we managed to exploit this vulnerability. So doing this when cool stuff comes up is a really cool way of getting people involved. We have regular labs and learning labs about backend security because you have different security languages and because we do, unfortunately, we're not completely standardized from an API perspective. So we have to run different backend security labs. We automate security tests with Selenium. These are all learning labs that we have run in the past. They've been quite successful. And then finally, we do CTF tournaments. This is one that we run in June. Turnout is really good. And this is the platform that we use. We use a platform called Secure Code Warrior, which effectively provides scenario-based questions, some attack-based questions saying, you know, this is the likely scenario. Your application has been attacked. But this group, it gives you the code, and you've got to go and actually fix the code to prevent the application from being exploited or from being attacked. So you end up basically with this is the next tournament that we've got coming up in 2020, the end of January. We have about 120 people taking part. It's run like a World Cup, so you've got different tiers, you've got playoffs, then playoffs you go to quarterfinals, semi-finals, and so on. And the whole tournament is run over the course of 5 weeks. And there is about 2,500 euros in prizes to be dished out to the various teams. So very quickly, then, in terms of lessons learned, every team works at their own pace. Be patient. So the requirements of one team may be very, very different, both in terms of maturity and both in terms of commercial requirements. So there is no expectation that we all need to get there at the same time. What's important is that we provide a framework for people to jump on. Get product or commercial stakeholders on board early. If they can understand the risk and if you're able to articulate what the problems are, you're much likely to get support in actually driving that change. Otherwise, it becomes a continuous battle. Don't build if you can buy. tooling. We spent a lot of time, and it's been a really interesting journey, but in hindsight, there's things we could have actually bought instead of buying. Enablement rather than blocking. Turning things off and telling people they can't do stuff, generally speaking, doesn't work. So it's a much better and more constructive conversation if you say, let's work out together how we can drive this forward. Yes, we know that it is broken. Yes, we know that we don't do this properly, but let's see how we can make that work within the context of our business. And then finally, and possibly the most important, security is everyone's job. We know this, but not everything is exploitable. I think there needs to be a sense of realism and pragmatism about the stuff that we really want to fix. Not everything is exploitable, and not all exploits are critical. So sometimes we need to say no, right? There are more important things to do. And having that, I guess, sense of pragmatism only helps driving the credibility. And generally speaking, if you go up to someone and say, hey, this is really important, hey, we need to do something about this, the chances of them listening to you are much, much higher. And that concludes my presentation. Do you guys have any questions for me? Yeah. I can share. I need to turn them into PDFs because there's a lot of kind of proprietary code, but I'll share them and send them back, and will be distributed through the work group.
How's it going to be shared? I didn't understand.
I will turn this into PDF, and then I'll give it back to your organization.
Upload that to the web.
They're also recording.
Which web? I mean, I can just really tell you because I don't really know. I'm not the guy for that, but I can ask.
Okay, so that
I don't want it to be on the web.
You can find the recordings too.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a recording, and I'll share. I'll make this available as a PDF once I'm done, so you'll be able to download it.
Okay. And the other question I don't remember.
No problem. Any more questions? All right, great. Thanks very much for your time.